I'm Raul, and I'm here with a catch wrestling practitioner, but also a amateur historian, right? Robbie Burrows. Welcome, Robbie.
Thanks for having me, Raul.
Okay, so he's been trying to learn catch wrestling for a while now, but then what we want to kind of talk about today is you are somewhat of an amateur historian where like you really try to seek out as much information about catch wrestling history as you can find, where you even go out and you try to locate all the oldest wrestling manuals you can. And so, oh, by the way, you're in England, right? So
Yeah.
so,
I'm only 2 hours from Wigan.
okay, can you kind of tell us about like some of the interesting things you've found with regards to like some of these old books that you've located?
Well, I think the oldest one, I recently bought a poster from 1904 of one of Hackenschmidt matches. George Hackenschmidt. Everyone's heard of that name.
Yeah, it's still big even in the bodybuilding community, right?
Yeah, he invented the hack squat and the bench press.
Yeah. So I kind of want to talk about a little bit about the development of modern catch wrestling. I wouldn't necessarily say modern because it's over 100 years old, right? Kind of the way we understand.
Yeah, I think it goes back to 1840, so we're talking near enough 200 years ago.
Yeah, and let's kind of talk about that because there were like early forms of what people were doing in the Lancashire region of England, but it wasn't until like there was like an attempt at cleaning up the sport to make it more presentable, right? That we have kind of what we understand as catch wrestling, where it's like say like wrestling oriented, really about trying to get the pin. A lot of times you can do a lot of these painful holds that nowadays we call them like submission holds, but a lot of times they were applied to get the person to roll over onto their back, and also like barring the stranglehold. Like so, this actually started a long time ago. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, it is. We were talking before the stream. A guy called Evan Strangler Lewis, who was really big in Farmer Burns' day about like the 1850s and 60s. He held on to an opponent. I think it was for 3 minutes, and the guy was dead. Like it actually had to pull his body out of the ring because he held the strangle on long. Anybody who's ever been choked, it doesn't take a lot. It only takes probably about 20 seconds for you to start losing consciousness.
Yeah, and I think we kind of discussed where there is more and more research coming out where people, especially like say jiu-jitsu athletes, since they don't bar the stranglehold and they practice often, right? So then they are damaging their arteries that go up to their brains. And sometimes people have injuries that are so severe where they end up basically bleeding out into the brain cavity, kind of similar to a stroke, but it'd be more actually similar to an aneurysm where they've damaged the different layers of the arteries so that they get weak and so then they can easily rupture. So so there is that kind of whole safety aspect about the chokes and stuff, but even if we kind of try to put ourselves in the mindset of people in England and the United States in that time period, they often didn't think it was like the best looking kind of way to win if you choke someone, but also even it doesn't demonstrate as much control because it seems like at that time, not only the Lancashire wrestling, but a lot of the different regional wrestling styles, the way to win was to put someone on their back. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, it was, but it was sometimes it was just quick fall that it wasn't even 2 seconds. If you get as soon as your back went onto the ground, but it was all on grass. You see, it was never on like mats or anything. Even Riley said it used to. He said in the he used to say it used to all be done on fields. It used to come down. Sometimes it was on asphalt, like concrete, like because they used to mine the coal or whatever out of the pit. Dad, I'm on a live stream. I'm talking to somebody, Dad. Sorry, that was my father. I apologize.
No problem. Continue. What were you saying? So they're uh-huh.
I've lost my train of thought now. But I was saying about Riley. Used to say it used to be all done on fields. It used to be done atop of pubs and allotments anywhere they could really, but they kept getting moved on, if you know what I mean, because it was sort of not illegal, but they didn't want it, if you know what I mean. So he had to, so he made his own gym or whatever, but he wasn't really but they don't really go into that much detail in the Hold Not Taken catch, you know, the documentary, into who taught him. You know what I mean? It doesn't tell you about any of the guys like Tom Connors, you know, people like that. A guy who taught him, Wino Kotonen, who was a Finnish wrestler. That's famous. Everyone's heard his name. But a guy who was not known as much as a guy called Pops Charnock, William Charnock, who was a very famous coach as well. You can find references to him, who Billy Riley out. They had a falling out, apparently, from what I can understand, if that makes sense. And it basically ran from Charnock's gym, which was seen as the better gym, because he trained the famous Belshaw brothers, who were very notorious in the 50s and early 60s. If you catch my meaning.
Yes,
that wasn't a pun, by the way. It was if you get what I mean, William Charnock was a guy of Irish descent, but if you look at Wigan, it's only 20 miles from Liverpool, and Liverpool has a lot of Irish immigrants. A hell of a lot.
Yeah, that was one thing. Like, this is kind of a side note, but I know, or like I've seen some comments online where I think maybe some people who live in the region, in the Lancashire region, they try to deny some of the Irish influence in that area. But I mean, it's like really hard to deny. Like you said, it's like geographically, it's not that far away, and Liverpool is a port city, so they
the main port actually to the United States. So that was where you used to have to go in the north to get a boat over, and it took like 2 weeks. But they used to have the old steamboats.
Wow. Geographically, that's very interesting because it seems a little bit out of the way because it's more of a northern city, and you might have more of the population in the southern London area, right? So then many people would have to travel all the way up to Liverpool and then take a boat. But that's
it's fascinating, and they even have the old embassy there, like the old US embassy. It's still there, but it's not an embassy obviously anymore, because then planes came in and made boats obsolete, obviously.
Yeah. So is that where the Beatles played? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
No. I think that was a bit way before 40 years before their time. They were in the early 60s, but a lot of Irish immigrants as well. If they don't like to deny it, but my grandfather, who passed away about 5 years ago, used to tell me in the bigger cities, he used to work up in the snow and the cold, putting up telephone poles, and there were no safety nets, anything. And he said not a lot of the northerners, but a lot of the Irish were treated terribly, like in the main cities, from segregation. That used to say, not just obviously there wasn't really segregation in the UK like there was in America, if you know what I mean. But you wouldn't have like segregated, you know what I mean, where they used to have, you know what I'm talking about anyway, about segregated, but
like
hotels in the 60s, in the early 60s, saying no black people and no Irish.
Yeah.
a lot of the thing, like no Irish people were allowed in to stay in a hotel. It was mainly in the cities, if you know what I mean, where they were like that.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I think that might be like some of that history, or some people might still be in that mindset where I've seen some of these comments where they're trying to deny the Irish influence. But anyway, I think that's kind of let's go back to talking
Yeah,
about catch wrestling. So yeah, I mean, the other thing I kind of want to touch on is just how old it is. I mean, you said that you've been able to find some references that go back a few hundred years. Is that correct?
going back to the 1600s, even like going
Okay.
back for 380, 400 years. Even that Ruslan, who I mentioned before the live stream, he even found references, because we started writing everything down, if you know what I mean. There's not newspaper clippings, but there's obviously books. There's also they used to, the earliest manual that I can find on catch wrestling had fencing techniques, you know, fencing, what they do in the Olympics with the swords and everything. But a lot of it was showing standing throws, like what's incorporated, you know, like the cross butter, not the half ouch, the flying mare, you know what I'm, the flying mare, the hank, which is
Mm-hmm.
another. But a lot of these throws and even submissions, they were called chips. I don't know why they called it that, but a lot of it, they called it chips. I can see references to a lot of the throws and thing. I think it was in sort of response, you know, Lancashire, all these variational styles to incorporate it into one, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it was like there were different regional styles response to what was happening in the Lancashire region.
Yeah. They amalgamated it all these techniques, but Britain had the biggest empire the world had ever seen at one time. They said the population of the British Empire now would be like 2.5 billion people if you
Yeah.
took all of them. That's crazy, isn't it? You know what I
Yeah.
mean now?
Yeah.
But a lot of these places, they brought things with them. Do you know what I mean? You had lots of interactions with different cultures, so they probably incorporated lots of other stuff into the wrestling. You know, like catch wrestling.
Yeah. And then I think that's a perfect segue to like who were, besides, say, we mentioned Irish, but there were other people who actually migrated into that region that really helped to form what we know as catch wrestling today. Do you want to talk about that? Like
Yeah.
go ahead, go ahead.
What you mean, like other cultures besides Irish and English, or what
The
was the
the
sort of
the
question?
Flemish,
Sorry
yeah,
about that.
the Flemish influence in catch wrestling.
Yeah, well, sort of 1700s, 1600s, they had Flemish weavers, because the cotton and wool trade were really big in Lancashire. That was one of the main places, you know, the woolen trade, like woolen mills, if you know what I mean, like cotton mills, they used to call
Yeah.
them,
Mhm.
where they
Yeah.
used to make all these things. And they brought stuff over, Flemish weavers from Belgium. There was no Belgium back then, though. It was all just called Holland
Mhm.
historically. But the Flemish came over to basically help them to learn how to weave, and they must have brought techniques over with them, if that makes sense. Like they influenced it as well.
Yeah, because it doesn't say there since their proximity. I think even to some of what was going on in the continental Europe and also Germany in particular. So then they kind of brought what they understood as grappling or wrestling, and then that became like amalgamated into Lancashire wrestling.
Well, if you look at it historically, you know, well, the Dutch came here. People forget that. There's a lot of there was a revolution 1690 where the actual William of Orange. You ever heard of Orangemen and Irish? You know, these religious tent. You ever heard of them? They're called the Orangemen. They have them in
No.
Ireland, in Glasgow, where they have these. It's like Protestants versus Catholics and all that. I'm not going to
Oh.
get into that, but even the
Uh-huh.
Dutch came over to the UK and tried to conquer it at one stage. So it's they probably brought stuff with them, and also the Hanovers, you know, the Hanoverian like the
Yeah.
German dynasty. That's
Yeah.
probably brought stuff over with them as well. You know, different techniques.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with all the stuff we kind of have been talking about, that say one thing that uh, I've seen kind of floating around the internet was that this was developed by the British Navy, or catch wrestling was developed by the British Navy, but a lot of the historical evidence doesn't corroborate that. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, yeah, I completely like agree with that, Raoul. That a lot of the Navy never invented British catch wrestling. Like going back to the point before, Britain had a massive empire, so you had different people from all over incorporating different, you know, influences into the British style of wrestling, which is known as catch as catch can.
Mm-hmm.
If you not, there were interactions with different cultures like India, Africa, because if you look at a lot of the African wrestling, which they do now in Senegal, and
Mm-hmm.
they get also Dambi in Nigeria and places like that, because they were ruled by the British as well.
Mm-hmm.
They probably brought stuff over where, you know what I mean. Wrestling is wrestling, if you know what I mean. But I'm saying historically, they the Britons had massive empires that spread across the world. So there's influences in our art, if you get what I mean.
Oh yeah, yeah, totally. And but I think I want people to also to understand is that they were also like there's a reason why it's called Lancashire Wrestling, right? I mean,
It was
maybe a lot.
originated in Lancashire, yeah.
Yes, yes. So and so then what that also implies is that there are other types of wrestling for other regions in England, or in that in that whole
See you
in that mix in the
tomorrow,
United
Dad.
Kingdom.
Sorry, it was just my father. See you later, Dad. Sorry, yeah. I was
No
just
problem.
saying bye to my father.
No problem. No problem. So that's also the other point that I kind of wanted to touch on is that there were several styles of grappling all over England. So that's why we have different names, and that's why you can't necessarily say that this was or catch wrestling, because nowadays we call it catch wrestling, but even in Japan, when they were introducing some of the catch wrestling influenced pro wrestling. I remember Osamu Matsunami. He told me that he thought it was called Lancashire Wrestling because that's how it was billed in a lot of the wrestling posters and all that. So um, that was one of the first like the first names that he associated with catch wrestling. And so I think even though there's all these different types of people that pass through that region, I think ultimately it is a style that is unique to that region, and therefore, when we say catch wrestling, it is still like this Lancashire melting pot kind of style, but it's not necessarily like something that was developed by a navy. And also, the other thing is that like England had different regional styles that were all popular too.
They had going into the regional styles in England. They had not just Lancashire in Cumberland, which is north of Lancashire, the county right next to Lancashire, called Cumberland Wrestling. They had Westmoreland Wrestling. They had Scottish Backhole, which was the national wrestling style in Scotland. You had the Cornish
Mhm.
wrestling, the jacket wrestling they used to call it.
Mhm.
Uh, you had Devonshire wrestling. You had loads of different, variational styles. I know that Henry VIII was a really massive fan of Cornish wrestling.
Yeah, yeah. So I think people should try to understand that, because also in the United States, we had different styles or regional styles of grappling or the way things were done. So it wasn't like catch wrestling was the only thing, or it's just things kind of grew in popularity. There's different trends and stuff, and some styles kind of got absorbed, or some of the main techniques of certain styles kind of got absorbed into other styles and stuff. So I kind of want people to understand that there's these differences, and catch wrestling still is unique. It's not just doing whatever you want, because that's the other thing that I kind of see a
Yeah.
lot. or I'm sure you see it
Anything
too
goes. I
online.
think it's anything goes sort of style, but it isn't though. That's what, even before I started, training up at the snake pit, I tried to find as much as information as I could. When I like something, I find out everything about it. Like the movements. I try to incorporate movements because everything's based on movement and things like that. Do you know what
Yeah,
I mean? Like muscle memory.
yeah. But then say like talking about those movements, it's like that can kind of tell you almost like you can think of it as like the language, right? So like different languages have different ways of saying things, and so the movements of catch wrestling are kind of its language, and its language of the authentic catch wrestling's language is different from what you see even in old jiu-jitsu manuals. I think someone was trying to ask me about like, oh, the Japanese really had a heavy influence on catch wrestling. But when you look at a lot of these old jujitsu books, they're not doing like these switches. There's different types of sit outs and stuff. Like, it's not the language is still the language of the movement is still different. And so, yeah, Lancashire is still like its own unique language. And just like any other like actual spoken language, I mean, yeah, they have different regional influences where you can kind of trace back when a certain culture kind of came into the area and maybe influenced a little bit, but they're still kind of like that core root that has like these stems and branches and stuff. Is that kind of what you understand it to be as well, or?
Yeah, exactly that, exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, I guess that's kind of one of the main things that I wanted to uh, like kind of point out, right? So I'm glad that
Yeah,
you can kind of elaborate on that as well. And then also too, since we kind of just touched on some of the stranglehold stuff, um, yeah, there was some earlier kind of like not earlier, but I mean like very way earlier, right? Like early 1800s, where there was a little bit more of kind of like what Lancashire fighting, where they didn't necessarily punch each other, but they still kind of kicked, and stranglehold was allowed, right? But
yeah,
again, in our like, oh, do you want to kind of talk about how it's like that? We kind of went from that to what both Frank Gotch and Farmer Burns called like the code of catch wrestling, where strangles were barred and still had this heavy influence on the pin. Would you like to talk about that?
yeah. But I'd say I think they understood, about catch wrestling. They understood what it was really about. I've heard some not nice things about, Frank Gotch. He was quite a dirty wrestler. I'm not trying to tarnish whatever he did, but he a lot of the times he would do like he would go and attack the leg. Do you know what I mean? Trying to injure his opponent. Like I think George Hackenschmidt, he had a horrible time because he wasn't used to the toe holds. Do you know what I mean? He never lived in the United States. He spent a lot of time in the UK. That's where he primarily lived. If you know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean. Yeah, I think he was Latvian or Estonian. I watched a really good documentary about George Hackenschmidt called by Rogue. It's called Rogue is the Rogue Legends of Strength, where it goes into about his life and where he came from. But he spent a lot of time in London, a lot of time there.
Yeah, so they weren't necessarily going for toe holds as much, right? So he wasn't
No,
so.
no, no. He wasn't used to it. Do you know what I mean? Because he kept attacking his legs, and I think he broke his hip. Hackenschmidt, he had a 4-year layoff. They didn't. I think. When was it they fought? They fought 1908, and they didn't fight again until 1913. And he was never the same after Frank
Mm,
Gotch had gotten through him. If you know what I
yeah,
mean.
yeah, totally. So that was, and then we can see kind of like that's kind of a regional difference between the United States and maybe Britain at that time. But still, I think we like that code was there where it was like, I mean, ultimately, if you see their books or even quite often like the toe hold that Frank Gotch used, a lot of times he would get the hold and like kind of raise the person or their legs off the ground so that they would have to let their shoulders touch the mat for the
Yeah,
pin.
they tried to roll over and use momentum. Like his signature toe hold was to grab the toe but also lift it. Do you know what I mean? Like you said, but the only thing they can do is to try and sort of relieve the tension on their heel or whatever on their, because that's what it is. Toe hold. It's bloody painful.
Yeah.
That's quite a British idiom, bloody, but it's horrible. Like you try roll over, but you end on your back and you get pinned. So it's setting you up for something else. It's like a fish. It's like a fisherman to a hook. If you're not, I mean, you're doing something to make the other guy think that you're going to do that, but then you do something else. Like it's
Yeah.
like chess.
Yeah. Totally. Cool. So, um, is there any other thing that you find interesting in catch wrestling history?
Well, I'd say the reason why I'm so interested in it is because my country, it's got something like familial bond. I've mentioned catch wrestling to people in the police force in the UK. Nobody's heard of it. If you go back 100 years from now, 1919, 1920, it was popular, one of the most popular sport in Britain, if you know what I mean. At that time, it was really taken off about, I'd say, 1910 to sort of 1920. That was when you had like sort of 1908, but the First World War did a lot of damage, to culture, not just in
Mm-hmm.
the UK, but in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
It wiped a generation of young men off the face of the earth, and it blurred history, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, of
If that
course.
if that makes sense to you, but especially with Frank Gotch, I think he was what they call, there's a old catch wrestling term, a ripper. Do you know what I mean by a ripper? That's it. People think, oh, is that not a serial killer? Like Jack the Ripper, but it's like an old
Yeah, go ahead and explain it for people who don't know, who might be
it's an
watching.
old Victorian term, like an old archaic term for somebody who can break something. Ripper means to tear something. Do you know what I mean? You've heard that expression, to rip something, like where you rip up a piece of paper. It's a bit like that. Somebody who knew what all the submission holds, was a shooter and knew the hooks or whatever. But this person, a ripper, was somebody who didn't just go for the pin. Somebody, even if they'd lost, been pinned or whatever, as long as they damaged their opponent, hurt their opponent just as bad or worse, they consider it a job done, which is really nasty. I know people think, oh, that's it, that sounds violent to me, but there are lots of, just because the strangle is barred doesn't mean all the joint locks, the toe holds, like working with John, obviously, that he's got that sort of, well, he's from Farmer Burns's lineage, but he's got that sort of, but more to go on submission than pin. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, definitely. I think that was a good explanation of it too. Yeah, definitely know what you're talking about. And that's the
But
other
that,
thing that too,
that was the term, to rip something. A ripper was somebody who broke something. You know what I mean? Frank Gotch, go and snap it. Like I said, he snapped his knee in half. George Hackenschmidt, he had to have a 4-year layoff after that match. He was never the same again. He was scared of people. Not scared, but it had an emotional effect on things as well.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and well, that's the thing. I think, like, so then going back to the whole choke thing, it's like people have to kind of stop thinking about it as necessarily the end all be all of, or the like,
Submission holds.
yeah.
It's like people think it's the only thing you can do, but I'm not going to talk about jiu-jitsu as this catch wrestling, but it did have influence. I'm not talking about judo, but a lot of what the Gracie said was unverifiable. If you look at a lot of the moves that the Gracies did, you can find it. Even Kimura, the guy who beat Gracie, he didn't learn from Carl Gotch, sorry. He
Mm-hmm.
learned from a guy called Ricky Kozen, who was a really famous Japanese wrestler during the 40s and 50s. He was sort of the first one to really study, catch wrestling. If that makes sense, that's the guy who taught Kimura
That
You
makes
know
a
what I
lot of
want.
sense to me. That makes a lot.
No, Japanese pro wrestler, but he was not. He's the one who taught Kimura. But Kimura was a really, for people who don't know what Kosen Judo is, if you look at it, Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, what the Gracies taught. He actually wrote a book on Nawaza because he was a really good Kosen Judo player, like collegiate. Kosen Judo's the collegiate form of judo in college, you know, like America has college wrestling or whatever. They had college version of judo, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I
And
kind of wish we had more styles offered in our colleges in the United States, like catch
yeah,
wrestling. Right.
but if you look at, he actually wrote a book. You can get it on budo.com.
Hmm.
On budo.com. He actually wrote a book on Nuwaza and Kosen Judo, and you look at all the submissions. It's identical to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Do you know what I mean? I think when Helio got beaten, I think he studied with Kimura a bit over there, because if you look, claiming that he was a judo, he wasn't just a judo player, but he understood both. Do you know what I mean? He didn't stand a chance, Helio, because I've heard people say he was the best judo player ever, and but he also went pro in Japan as part of Ricky, that guy I mentioned before, Ricky Dozen. I can't pronounce his name. I'm not very good with pronouncing Japanese names, obviously, but he's a really famous guy in the 50s. Ricky Dozen. People credit Carl Gotch calling him the god of wrestling, but this guy was the one who sort of got the Japanese interested in catch wrestling. You know, like is it Osamu Matsunami? I pronounced that right.
Yes.
Yeah. He learned not just through Roy Wood, as people know. He learned from Billy Robinson as well in Japan. Like he studied both with two of the best, I think, ever. You know, so far as teaching catch wrestling, I'm saying Billy Robinson. For people who don't know, in the jiu-jitsu, who are interested in just submission grappling, he taught Sakuraba, but not many people know that, you know, in jiu-jitsu circles or whatever.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So, and also that history is kind of fading away nowadays, right? As
Yeah, it
time
is.
goes.
It's 20 years ago. It's ancient history. I was only 2 years of age when Hoist Gracie fought Sakuraba. But I think if you look at Billy Robinson, the way he, in his pro matches where he cartwheel past somebody's guard, well, you
Yeah.
know, to pass somebody's line of defense, it's identical. Like
Hmm.
going back to movement, do you know what I mean? Like what he was doing was identical to Billy Robinson. And when I went up to Wigan for the first time, I could tell what he was doing was the real stuff. You know, go into Roy Wood, who's excellent, I'd say, but he's 77 now, and I love his style, but there's not many people. Tommy Hayes, who's a very famous, not famous, but you know, he helped after Riley died. Billy Riley, he helped keep the snake pit open. If you see what I mean,
Yep.
relocated it, all the roof collapsed.
Yeah. No, but he just recently passed as well.
Yeah,
Tommy.
Tommy Hayes. Yeah, he
Yeah.
which was a shame, to be honest, because he apparently, you know, the book that Stephen Greenfield wrote. You know, Billy Riley, the man, the story, the legacy. He helped Stephen a lot of the information on Billy Riley.
Um, that's too bad.
He was a savant. He was really into his history as well, from what I heard, into cat.
Mm. All right. So let's go ahead and try to end it here. But if anybody wants to comment or like get in touch with you, what's the best way to find you?
Just go onto my Instagram. It's Robbie loves catch and then _98. That's my Instagram. That's how most people get hold of me. But that's I could. Well, I'm good at finding, you know, people who if people I'm not qualified, nowhere near qualified. I've only probably been practicing catch now for about a year. properly training. I was always interested in it for a couple of years, but I was going through personal stuff at the time that it wasn't advantageous, if you know what I mean, to go up there. I didn't really know who was, who did catch and who wasn't, because there's a lot of, like we said, there's a lot of misinformation around on the internet.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of chat with you today, is because there's so much misinformation. So at least I want to try to at least put out a little ray of light.
Right.
So yeah, so then people want to contact you, go ahead and find Robbie on Instagram, and we'll go ahead and end it here. But I know even with quarantine, it's tough to train. Sometimes I have to.
Oh, it is. It really is. A lot
Yeah,
of the martial arts club, even in British wrestling, in the Freestyle British Wrestling Association, they've suspended all competitions for the rest of this year.
yeah. Which
And
ultimately is for the best, but hopefully we can get back to training normally and having the ability to have a wide variety of training partners. I think that's one of my favorite things. Meeting new people, grappling with them, and all that. But I guess it'll have to wait.
yeah, thank you for having me, Raul. I really appreciate it. I was surprised. I didn't, when you asked me, because I'd never expected for people to ask me, if you know what I mean. I'm happy just being a part of, catch wrestling and trying to keep the history, as clear as possible.
Yeah, well, I saw that, so I wanted to help give you a voice. So yeah, hopefully we can talk. Or if there's anything new that you find, let me know, and we can probably try to share that with other people as well.
Yeah. Take care. Thank you very much, Raul. I appreciate it for you taking your time to talk to me.
No, you're
Bye-bye.
very welcome. Thank you. Bye bye.